name is Beatrice Senahan. I'm the Director of ICT at the University of Galway, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Innovation Value Institute to interview Stephanie Woerner from MIT CISR. And Stephanie, you're very welcome, and thank you for speaking to us.
And Beatrice, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to our interview.
Great, and this is the first of our Thought Leaders workshop, so thank you, Stephanie, and we'll continue from here.
I'm Stephanie Woerner. I'm a principal research scientist and relatively newly the director of MIT Center for Information Systems Research. We're a research center within the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and we do research on issues that really big companies are tackling in terms of digital transformation. So we have a stream of research on digital business models and digital transformation. And my colleague, Barb Wixom, does research on data and data monetization. And then Nils does research on innovation, and Nick does research on talent and governance. So we try to really cover areas that I think big companies are, the mission that we have is how to help large companies succeed in the digital economy. And, with legacy systems and things like that, it's an ongoing issue.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. And congratulations, I believe recently you've been appointed as director of CISR.
Yes, and it's a whirlwind. So meeting people, figuring out all of the back end that as a researcher, I was really not, I didn't need to know about. So yeah, it's been a very busy couple of months here.
Fantastic. So thank you for that background on yourself and on the programs in CISR. So the focus of the interview is digital transformation, and I know you have two books in particular that I've come across. What's your digital business model? And I know you're coming out with a new book soon, so we might touch on that a little bit. But could I just ask you, Stephanie? We hear the term digital transformation; it's ubiquitous, and it seems to mean all things to all people, but would you mind just giving us a little synopsis of what you feel that means?
So when we talk about digital transformation, we mean two things. When you talk to most executives and you ask them, what do you think about when you think about a digital transformation? Many of them, not all, but many, think about, oh, I'm going to automate my processes and I'm going to take all of the paper and I'm going to digitize that and I'm going to, get rid of spreadsheets. And that's one part of a digital transformation. So that's around the area of what we think of as operational efficiency. And that's around simplifying your processes, automating your processes, and in the as you get better and better, reusing and then also at the same time integrating your silos. So I think that's one piece, but that's actually not enough for a digital transformation. The other part of a digital transformation is using digital technologies and actually some of the building blocks that you create as part of the operational efficiency, as well as creating new ones to engage your customer. So a digital transformation, the way that we think about it is actually, it's doing two things simultaneously. It's taking out costs and it's innovating. And that's one of the reasons that it's so hard to do, because you're being asked to do two very different things using digital to achieve them both.
That's really interesting, Stephanie. Thank you for that. Very good definition of digital transformation, and it does sum up that operational efficiency aspect, certainly. And I know there are other key components as well to digital transformation. In your book, in your 2018 book, you refer to ecosystems versus value chain. And I suppose we've moved more towards that ecosystem way of thinking, away from value chain, or perhaps value chains still have a relevance. Would you mind just giving us a little bit of background on that?
So when we were doing that book, we actually started that research in 2012. So it you know, the research takes a while to get to book form. But what companies were starting to realize was that digital was starting to open up their boundaries, make them more porous. And at the same time, a lot of companies were starting to realize that when they wanted to put together an integrated offering, often they couldn't do it themselves. In fact, it's a rare company that could put together a number of integrated offerings only using their types of products and services. And so you need to bring in other companies' services. So for instance, a lot of these offerings depend on knowing who the customer is, and you may know who the customer is and what their purchase history is, but you may also need to have identity management. And as a company, you may not want to invest in that, and there are other companies out there that with an API enabled service can provide that for you. So you want to be able to bring them in. And so this idea of value chains versus ecosystems was that we saw companies trying to figure out how they were going to open up and bring in those other partners. And then also customers were becoming more important. Digital was changing the way that customers interacted with the company. And so it meant that you had to actually be able to know how to do that also with them. So it's not that value chains are not still important. I mean, there are some efficiency reasons for value chains, there are control issues, but there are a number of firms that have their business models moved completely away from the value chain. We still see, I would say, parts of banks' offerings, you know, manufacturers, they have value chains. But almost every company that we've talked to is opening up and figuring out that they need to partner some. And so while their business model may be dominantly centered in a value chain, almost every company has some aspect of ecosystem that is now important to them.
It's very interesting. And I know Amazon was a particular example in how they've leveraged their business model to, you know, to really take advantage of that broader ecosystem. So it's interesting to hear how that research came about. Just moving on a little bit to the area of data, and you mentioned one of your colleagues in Scissor who focuses on that particular research area. The importance of customer data, those profiles, it's such a leveraging opportunity for digital businesses. But is there a dichotomy between that and trying to value the privacy and individual NRR? Do you think our customers kicking back a little bit from that perspective?
I think that they may be kicking back some. And in fact, my colleague Barb Wixom does do some research on what she calls data creepiness. So I think that it's a real balancing act for companies, that they have got to know how to serve their customers well, but at the same time, you can't make them feel so odd about what you know about them that they leave, because and then also there are the back end, front end types of issues. So for instance, you may find it as a company useful to have all of your customer data integrated in the back end, but then you may want to be very, very careful about what you present to the customer on the front end. So, you know, for the back end, you may be doing it for efficiency purposes, for helping you innovate to try to figure out new types of offerings, but you may not want to tell the customer everything that you know about them. And then there's also issues around who owns that data. I mean, I think here in the United States, we're certainly behind where Europe is in terms of data privacy and who has access to the data. And so this is going to be an ongoing issue. And especially as digital enables more and more types of data. So I was just reading an article about passport control in US airports and how it's all moving to facial recognition. And there's not a real, they haven't come up with a real need for why we need to track everybody's face. And are they tracking everybody's face? And so there are questions that really arise around the different types of data that companies have about you, how they're using the data, what they let customers know they know about them, and then again, who owns that data?
Very interesting, and similar to the article you just read this morning on our Irish media, there was a focus on CCTV facial recognition for crime investigation, and they, both arguments, for and against that. And obviously, if it helps to catch criminals, it's a good thing. But how controlled is that information? So I think that is a concern. And you mentioned GDPR and the European context, and versus the US context. And you touched on a little bit there, Stephanie, but I'm just wondering, your business model, your digital business model, and that focus on customer data and the profiles and the value obviously that brings to an entity, and that US model or the US usage versus the European, what do you see there as the challenges or differences, or can we mirror the advantages from both perspectives?
Well, I think that that the companies that we study, they actually all are aware of the US context and the European context. They're global, multinational companies. And so they have to, they're juggling the laws on all hands. I don't have a real sense of what companies are struggling. I mean, I know they're struggling. And I know that here in the United States, there are regulatory issues around, one, how large you can become, and two, about how much data that you have, and then what you're doing with that data. I haven't seen anything come out of that. Whereas I think with GDPR, the European context, at least companies know what they have to do. I mean, I think it's challenging for them. And I think at times, they are trying to figure out what does it all mean, because they've got to interpret the law, but it's certainly more than you have here in the United States.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And I suppose it's important to note that in the IVI, one of the key research areas is that around data governance. So the European Centre for Data Governance and Power is based in IVI. I think we focus so much on the technology and we've leveraged the technology, but there is a realization that the governance of that data is just so important as we progress, with more usage of data. And just moving on then to maybe where we're going with digital transformation and new ideas and new concepts. And I know you have a new book coming out, Stephanie, The Future Is Now. Would you tell us a little bit about that, and what are the emerging thoughts around that?
Sure, I would love to. The new book, it's called Future Ready, The 4 Pathways to Capturing Digital Value, is coming out next week, October 18th. And so in the background, as we've got people asking us to tell us about the book. It's kind of a crazy time right now at MIT CISR. But in this book, one of the things that we figured out in talking to senior executives is that they knew that they had to change. And thinking about how digital was going to affect their business model, they thought they had an idea of what were the ways that they wanted to make money, but then they were struggling with, well, how are we going to get there? What's it going to take to actually transform ourselves to realize a new business model? And so this is when we started doing more work on digital transformation. And so the base of the book is that what is future ready? And I talked about it in one of your previous questions about what is digital transformation. And so we call a company that is actually transformed enough that they can simultaneously take out costs, focus on operational efficiency, and really engage the customer with digital to be future ready. And those are companies, again, they have this simultaneous innovation and taking out costs, but they're also operating with modular agility. As they've moved further along, they've created components, especially around the things that they do well. So for instance, if they have figured out a process, simplified the process, and then figured that this is the one best way, say, to onboard a customer, they then start to make components out of that and then can plug it and play throughout the whole enterprise as you create an offering. So that modular agility is really important. They focus on the customer, and the customer becomes that customer's voice is really amplified throughout the company. And then finally, they're ecosystem ready and they're able to digitally partner. And so when we're talking about digitally partnering, we're not talking solely about those partnerships where you have really deep integrations, where you have lots of negotiation back and forth, but we're talking more about that kind of plug and play API enabled partnering. And that for us is a future ready company. And then what we see is companies in the three other quadrants. Most companies start, and most large companies are starting in a quadrant in the area we call silos and spaghetti, where they are typically product driven, and they have this complex landscape of data and technology and processes, and they have great people, but those people really have to operate with heroics because the systems just don't let them do their job as well. And so they have to know who's the right person to talk to. They have to know, well, if I go here and I talk to that person here, and then I talk to that person there, I can get all of the information and I can serve the customer. So from silos and spaghetti, if you move solely along the operational efficiency, you can end up in the industrialized quadrant, where you're really focused on creating the one best way to do something, integrating your silos, service enabling your components. But as you'll notice there is not as much emphasis on the customer. On the other hand, if you feel because of a competitive need that you have to truly just focus on your customer, those companies they're really focusing on the experience, and they're giving what we call an integrated experience, but it's simulated. So there's a wrapper around all of that complexity. And at some point, if they're going to get to future ready, they're then going to have to focus on the operational efficiency. So we define a future ready company, and then we talk about the 4 pathways to get there. Do you go through industrialized? Do you go up through integrated experience and then have to make a turn toward future ready? Do you take a series of smaller steps, like stair steps? So a series of projects that alternate focus between operational efficiency and customer experience to get to future ready? Or do you throw your hands up and say, you know, I have this opportunity and I can't get there with what I have, so I'm going to just start a new future ready business unit? And from there, we then go into detail with case studies and talk about some of the challenges and issues like that.
It's very interesting. I guess a lot has to do with that, you know, the maturity of the business, the nature, the scale of that business, and the best approach to take. One of the first books that I read from Scissor, from MIT, was Enterprise Architecture and Strategy. And it talked a lot about capabilities. And I see capabilities still have a relevance, even in, you know, the current research. Could you discuss that a little bit, please, Stephanie, and tell me how that might fit in with the new thinking around digital transformation?
So we have been thinking about capabilities. I will say the last book talked about capabilities, 8 capabilities to develop. And in this book, we have identified 10 capabilities that future-ready companies have. And we think about them in terms of the types of value that they are most focused toward. Now, when we talk about foundational capabilities, those are often around the people that you have. So really great companies that have figured out how to use digital, focus on rapid learning. What is it that you're doing to get rapid learning throughout the organization? And often companies are using methods like Agile, test and learn, minimum viable products, and then taking those lessons and bringing those lessons, keeping them. I mean, the hard part is learning that you have to learning the lesson, but then you have to use that information and also then disseminate it throughout the enterprise. The second, there are issues around incentives tying individual behavior to enterprise goals as being one of the big issues, and capabilities that we find that leaders have to develop. And those, so we have 4 foundational capabilities that the other 3 types of value build on top of. And so there are capabilities around operational value. And so that is around modular agility. So this idea that, again, I talked about it with the components, and taking out, again, being able to develop that simultaneous ability to take out costs and focus on the customer. If you're looking at customer value, we're finding that purpose, that an organization's purpose is really important, both in motivating your employees, but also in motivating your customers to do business with you. And so we're finding that that's one issue that, and one capability that companies need to develop. And then when we talk about ecosystem value, we're talking about being ecosystem ready, and also this ability to partner and to bring partners, products, and services into your organization. So yes, capabilities are still very, very important, and they're crucial to actually developing the value that every company that's in a digital transformation is trying to achieve.
Very good. That's very interesting. Thank you for that insight, Stephanie. Organizational change management hasn't gone away. As we see as a challenge in some of the projects we're working on. Can you tell me a little bit about the approach and what we should do, and the power of taking the correct approach to change management?
So we when we are looking at this digital transformation, we talk about 4 big, what we call explosions. And we were being provocative when we chose the term, but when we talked to senior executives and they talked about what they were trying to do, they often used metaphors around explosions, blowing up what you'd done and how it felt to them. And so we see 4 huge changes that you have to really have a plan to anticipate, to manage, and with that organizational change. So these 4 big changes are around, one is allocating decision rights. Do you have the right people in the key areas to make decisions? And do you have the people in place that you're able to tap into that can fulfill those roles? And so with that, you have to be able to know who's responsible for what is going to get done. And that's often at your leadership level. But then we're finding one of the big areas is decoupling that from how it gets done. And that is a decision right that you really have to push down to the people who are actually doing the work. And that's one of the biggest changes that we're finding. And it's incumbent on leaders to move from a command and control to really a coach and communicate. And so that's one big area that we're finding organizational change. It's not just setting the vision and saying, everybody follow this. It's more of, here's what the vision is, and then communicating it over and over and over again, and then helping and coaching your people along the way. So all of the organizational change types of initiatives are going to be supporting that kind of movement to a coach and communicate. And then we see three other big changes. One is around new ways of working. And again, when we talk about that, it's important in multiple ways. The new ways of working are one way of bringing in the customer voice into the ways that you're working, because you're iterating, you're testing something out, you're going out to the marketplace, seeing what works, what resonates. But the other piece that it does help with is using data. Because if you're going to use agile ways of working, it's really data driven. It's this idea, you have a hypothesis, you're going to try something, you're going to see if it works. And then we think that this is one way of really developing the culture, is changing people's habits, their work habits. The third big organizational change is really around developing that platform mindset. This harkens back to what you talked about with Genie and enterprise architecture, is that how do you integrate those silos? How do you create a mindset where you're going to immediately think of finding the one best way to do something and then reusing it over and over again? The final big change, and it's one that it's really important. It often, with some companies, when they start a digital transformation, they want to go first to this. And we actually argue that companies should think about their decision rights first. And that last change is around, we call it organizational surgery. It's around restructuring. And that often is really challenging for your people, because you're asking them to really, you're kind of blowing the organization up around them. And so that's one of the big ones. But I think that if you could, that companies need to adapt and need to figure out change management around all four of these big areas. Now, the organizational surgery one, the restructuring, I think it depends on your time frame for your transformation, and I think it depends on the appetite for change. We've seen some organizations really decide that they've got to radically rethink how they've structured the organization, and we've seen others saying, we're going to do this incrementally, a long time, people are going to get used to it, and it's very much easier on their people when they can do it that way.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that, Stephanie. And I think in particular, when we talk about the organizational change, and you mentioned about the line manager and the supervisor and the doers, and the importance of leveraging what the value that those team members, I think, can bring to a digital transformation is really important. Your research approach and your method in the IVI and in Maynooth University, a frequently used research method is design science. So it's a qualitative approach, the development of an artifact, which could be a model, a method, etc. Just could you tell me a little bit about the approach that was taken for your book from a research point of view?
So I would say at Scissor we have two ways of approaching a problem, and they both incorporate the same elements, but in different, they do them in different time frames and time. So with our book, we started by doing workshops with our sponsors and patrons, and kind of, I would say, conversations with senior leaders about what were the issues around changing your company to take advantage of digital. So you have this digital business model. How are you going to get there? What is it that you're doing? What is it that, what are some of the big issues that you're grappling with? And then from there, we brainstormed and came up with a this was an interesting project because with digital business models, it took a while to get to the framework, and we had provisional frameworks, and then we tried things and really until we found the 2 dimensions. Actually, the future ready framework, I think that business leaders were so articulate about the problems that they were facing. It actually required very little iteration. So the future ready framework, we came together, talked about what, Peter came in one day and said, okay, how does this, what do you think about this? And I looked at it and I said, this is really interesting. I think we can do something with this. And then, so we started with the future ready framework, and then with the pathways that came about as we iterated more with workshops. So you talk about, well, okay, so if this is the future ready framework, so how do you get to future ready? And then you do, again, more interviews, more talking, and you overlay the pathways on top of that. Now, Peter and I do a lot of research with survey data. And so we actually go into a survey pretty early compared. I have other colleagues who do lots and lots of interviews and then come up with a framework and do case studies around that. And then they'll do a survey near the end of their project to have data points and descriptive statistics around what their framework says. I would say that Peter and I will do some initial discussions and initial work. We'll often then go to a survey to start measuring things and seeing if their ideas that we had in the discussions actually worked out. And then we'll build out the framework even more. And then again, we're always testing it, though. We always go out to our sponsors and patrons and say, okay, what do you think about this? How does this resonate with you? Could you use it? Does it help with your thinking? Does it help create a common language? Because that's one of the biggest challenges that a digital transformation imposes on the whole organization, which is, are you all on the same page? Are you talking about it in the same way? And with the Future Ready framework, as I said, that one actually, a lot of the articulation came with the digital value, but the framework itself and the pathways, they resonated very early on in the process. And so we kept those the same. But I think our research method sounds quite similar to yours.
It does, and that's exactly what I was thinking as you were describing it, Stephanie, an informed a priori. You have a model or framework that you're validating, and then that iterative and reflective approach to the qualitative methods, and inductively then feeding back in. So not unlike the design science approach taken in Maynooth.
Well, and it's so important. This is why our consortium, our member consortium, is so valuable, because they're out there, they're doing this, and they are a sounding board. And they let us know when something doesn't work, and they are also there to say, have you thought about this? So it's very it's a great model in terms of bringing in that executive, that leadership voice.
Fantastic. So we're getting towards the end of the interview, Stephanie, but I wanted to ask you about adaptability of the model. It was very much a commercial perspective, and from a nonprofit point of view, for us in the University of Galway, I mentioned we're doing a student digital pathways transformation program. It will be platform based. It will, leveraging cloud technologies. Capabilities are a huge part of the design of the approach that we're taking. So just thinking about that from a digital transformation, where we're not measuring the value based on for-profit metrics, but where is that adaptability, and where can we leverage the kind of thinking in your new book?
So I will, the publishers pushed us to actually think about small companies. And what was surprising to us was that the model worked very well for small companies. And in fact, we could learn something from small companies, large companies could, which is smaller companies were closer to their customer. Now let's think about it from a nonprofit point of view. I think one of the good things about the model is one of the dimensions is efficiency. So it's not as much around profit as it is around productivity, taking out sources of friction, making it easier to fulfill your mission. And I think that the customer focus is, so I think both axes actually are quite good for nonprofits, because we're not talking about generating profits. I think where you need to think about the changing it is really around the kinds of value that you're capturing and creating. And I think there you may find that you need to have different metrics. So on the ecosystem value, that's one where we have measured it by revenues coming in from your ecosystem and revenues coming in from your partners. And so there, I think that what you want to start thinking about is, instead of revenues, are there other things that your partners provide for you? So one of the measures for ecosystem value also is, how much data do you see from the ecosystem? And I think that's going to be the same for both profit and not-for-profit companies. So you might focus on data. You might focus, instead of revenues from partners, maybe it's number of partners, maybe it's partners, the variety of services that you can into your organization. I think you can do the same with the other two sources of value. So with operational value, because that is really internal, again, I think you could focus on productivity. You could focus on, simplification, things like that. And then with customer value, instead of focusing on revenues for your customer, there's probably other metrics that are going to be better for the nonprofit context. So perhaps it's fulfilling customer needs. It could be around, we say cross-selling, but maybe it's not cross-selling. Maybe it's fulfilling a bigger span of customer problems. So I think that not-for-profits are going to have to think about this, but I think the large categories of value that we talk about certainly do lend themselves. And in some ways, they're going to be stronger. I mean, one of the capabilities that we talk about companies needing to build, which is, what's your organization purpose? I mean, not-for-profits, they know that. They lead with that. And so I think that for-profit companies can learn from not-for-profits because that's becoming so strong. So I think it will work quite well. I just think that it will mean that when you create your dashboard, you're going to have to stand back and think about, what is operational value, what is customer value for you, what is ecosystem value, and then use those metrics instead of, say, a profit measure or a growth.
Very good. That's really interesting, Stephanie. And I can already see an adaptability for our own project. And I'm thinking platform-based approach. It's that student life cycle from recruitment all the way to graduation, and that experience for the student is so important. At that, Stephanie, I think we've covered a lot of the topics, and really grateful for your time. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope we get to meet in person sometime.
I'd love to. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.